All right. So in my previous lesson, we talked about three temptations. Well, I should not read on the board anymore. I was about to turn around and point to the board. But three temptations, and one, external opposition, the drifting, and discouragement. And so then we talked about how the call for us to hold fast is addressed not to people who have already quit, but to people who were in the middle of pressure. They were being tempted to quit. They were being tempted to give up, to go back to what was comfortable for them. And so one of the things we talked about was what happens when people don't hold fast. And that's what we're going to kind of continue tonight, is what happens when we don't hold fast. You know, what happens when we as a collective body of believers don't do that, and how can we prevent it? Because again, like Brother Jim was talking about, in order to illustrate this, the writer of Hebrews, the author of Hebrews, takes them to a familiar story, takes them into the wilderness. And Brother Jim talked about this, but he talked about the wilderness journey, the people in the wilderness, and so what he's doing is he's actually taking a story that was familiar to them, and tells them today. Like he said, that's one of the key words in chapter 3, verse 1 is today. So don't if you don't listen. And so what I want to do is I want to just walk through this and talk about how we can prevent hardening. But first of all, again, just to kind of recap, why the wilderness generation? Why did he go back to that? Because, really, he could have gone back to a number of different examples in the Bible, right? What are some that y'all can think of off the top of your head? Okay, Hosea, right? Israel, really, and he used Hosea and Gomer to help illustrate the falling away, right? Cain. You kind of briefly mentioned that in your lesson. Solomon. He could have pointed to any number of illustration or examples. So why the wilderness generation? And again, because and none of this is just willy-nilly. He didn't just say, the author of Hebrews didn't just open up the Old Testament and close his eyes and go, okay. Right there, wilderness generation. It wasn't random. And the people in the wilderness generation, they weren't, some group of pagans who didn't know God. We established that fact, right? They were God's covenant people. Again, they had seen the works of God. They had seen the plagues. They had gone through the sea. They ate the manna. They drank water from a rock. And they had heard the voice of God at Mount Sinai. All right, so they'd done all those things. They'd experienced all those things, but yet, like Brother Jim said, they still hardened their hearts. And that's the point, is that the danger that the author of Hebrews is warning us against is not someone who has never known the grace of God. The danger is somebody who has known the grace of God, who's seen and tasted and been carried by the grace of God, but then who, through whatever, the pressures of life or, testing or just through our own disobedience, has allowed their hearts to grow resistant to his grace. All right, so and the thing is, we read about the wilderness generation, and it's easy for us as believers today to read about the wilderness generation. Brother Jim kind of mentioned this in his lesson, but to read about it and see ourselves safely on the other side, like that's them. Shame on them. Can't believe they did that. But, today, right now, that's not something that I'm dealing with, or I'm safe from that, right? And we would have said, well, there's no way I would have been like them. But the author of Hebrews is writing to people who would have thought like that. He's writing to, because remember, he's writing, this is the New Testament, all right? So he's not writing to, just a few generations even down the line. This is how many years later? 1,000 years later? Yeah, maybe more than that. I was just trying to think off the top of my head really quick. Yeah, 1,700 years maybe after that. Right, so we're talking about a long time. So the temptation would have been for them to do the same thing, right? And so he's actually writing to a people who would make that same statement or have that same thought. He's writing to people who were struggling with, breaking away and going back to their former life. He was writing to people who were suffering for their faith. And so the thing is, we now, still, us today, can struggle with the same thing. Because the wilderness generation isn't just a cautionary tale against them, right? It's for us too. It's a warning for us. And so that affects the way that we read this passage, because if the generation that saw the hand of God and who saw all the miracles of God could let their hearts go astray, then the question isn't how did they end up there, it's what would it take for us to end up there. All right, so then the warning is for us to be sure that we don't, right? To pay attention, to take heed, so that we don't drift, and then so that, because in drifting we get so far and we get so far removed that our hearts become hardened. And then it's like Brother Jim said, it's once you drift so far, it's actually easier to harden your heart than to get back to where you should be. And so we want to avoid that. So how does that happen? How does the hardening actually happen? Well, look at verse 13, and it talks about the hardening process. But it says, "But exhort each other every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin." All right, so look at what he's not saying. He's not saying that hardening comes from the power of sin or the weight of sin. What does he say? Where does it come from? The deceitfulness of sin. All right? So he's actually making an observation on how the hardening process works, because it doesn't just come, it doesn't just show up and say, hardening of your heart doesn't just show up and say, hey, here I am. What happens? It comes from, drifting, and it comes from just, and also when, as you drift, the more you become, the less concerned with the things of God you become. All right, so hardening of the heart always begins with a misrepresentation of reality. In other words, well, look at what the wilderness generation went through. Okay, so they had manna. Was the manna real? Was that a real thing that they got? Yeah, absolutely. Right. It sounds far-fetched, but it's true, and it really happened. All right. But what did they start to do? They started complaining, or they started grumbling about it. Right. What did they say? Man, we're tired of eating this stuff. Man, can't we get something nice, like a nice steak or something? They started complaining about the manna, but that God was miraculously providing for them. All right, so was the Exodus real? Did it really happen? Did God really rescue them out of Egypt and take them out of Egypt and into, the wandering, but up to the edge of the promised land? Did God really do that? Yeah. But what did they keep doing? I mentioned it this morning in the sermon. They just kept grumbling. And what did they actually have the nerve to say? Man, we were better off in Egypt. You should have just left us there. I mean, at least, like I said this morning, at least we had food. We had a stable living environment. We weren't wandering around going from place to place, we were actually better off in Egypt. Is that true? No, absolutely not. There were slaves in Egypt. They were foreigners in Egypt. Was God present with them? Was God with them? Yeah. You mentioned it. The pillar of fire and the cloud of smoke. All right. The tabernacle. When eventually they got it, we're not there yet. But eventually, when they got the tabernacle, God dwelt with them. But God was with them, right? God's presence was real. But what did they start this morning? What did we talk about with the golden calf? We don't know where this guy Moses went. We don't know what's happened to him. So they took things into their own hands, and they started speaking as if God weren't present, as if he were absent. And so they made a golden calf. And one of the things that they said about it was what? Well, when they told Aaron, make us a god, or some translations make us gods. What do they say? That can go before us. Right? Man, that's scary. So that's the deceitfulness of sin, right? The manna was real, the deliverance was real, God was with them, but yet they doubted all of those things. Because that's what sin does. It doesn't always come as something that we know is like obviously wrong. It comes as kind of reframing what's true, and and allowing ourselves to reframe the situation to where we think, well, it's not so bad. It's just one little thing. God would forgive. God would allow it. If God wants me to be happy, so God should allow it. We start to rationalize. And so that makes the slow drift away from faithfulness feel okay. It's reasonable. It's just no big deal. But in 1942, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called the Screwtape Letters. All right, and this is what he says, or he wrote, and so what it is it's letters from a senior demon named Screwtape to his apprentice, nephew, Wormwood. All right, now remember, this is 1942 that he's writing this. And in one of the passages, he describes Screwtape's counsel on how to lead someone away from God. All right, and he doesn't recommend dramatic temptation. He recommends something more subtle. And he says the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts. And so, C.S. Lewis understood that the deceitfulness of sin, he understood the deceitfulness of sin, and he, because he says, because he says most dangerous movements aren't the ones that don't feel like movements at all. They feel like adjustments. They don't feel like these big, grand movements. They just feel like adjustments. And so it's a slow settling of things that then start to become hardened. And so, what we'll do then is we'll sometimes use language to describe our situation, like, I just need a break, or I'm just being real. It's just not a good season for me right now to be with the family of God, or it's not a good season for me right now to be active in the body of Christ. But none of those things are necessarily faults. Like, sometimes we do need a break. Sometimes not from like church, but sometimes we do actually, we are exhausted. Sometimes we do just need to rest. But the thing is, these statements are kind of reframing, like what I was talking about. Like they're justifying, they're reframing the situation, and it's what the author is warning against here. Moving away from God and making it sound like it's maturity or wisdom. And so that's what deceitfulness is. That's how sin deceives us. Because really most of us, if we're really honest with ourselves, we could name a time in our lives when we were just being honest about God or about the church or whatever. When actually what was happening was that our pain was talking for us. Our fear was talking for us. And so the hardening that is described in Hebrews 3, again, just the whole point of that was just to say that it's not sudden. So the Greek word to harden has the image of something that becomes rigid over time. Bone, for example. When a baby's born, are their bones all just solid as a rock? No, you got to be careful with a newborn, right? Because their bones aren't fully formed. They're not fully developed yet. But over time, that bone hardens, and the baby's able to then walk and do things that they couldn't do before because of the hardening of the bone. If you leave a leather belt out in the sun too long, leather belt's soft and pliable, but if you leave it out in the sun too long, what's going to happen? It's going to dry up, and it's going to harden. And so hardening isn't just a one-time, all of a sudden type event. It's repeated movements. It's repeated things in the same direction. So look at verse 10. They always go astray in their hearts. All right, so when do they go astray? Always. That's not just a one-time thing, right? It wasn't a one-time rebellion. It was actually it had become a pattern of a people who had resisted God, and we didn't end up getting to it in the sermon. This is actually one of the first times, Brother Jim. It's funny in my sermon this morning, I actually just ran out of time. I had way more ground to cover, and for some reason we just didn't get to it. And I have no explanation for it. I had the same amount of notes as I would normally have. It's just like, but I just got to a point where I was just like, we've got to stop, and I'll just pick this up. That's the great thing about walking verse by verse through the Bible is you can just stop and pick up next week. But it's funny. So I read these verses, but I didn't actually get to it, where God actually calls them remember. So their complaint against Aaron, where he said, this fellow Moses. This guy Moses over here who led us out of Egypt, we don't know what happened to him. Then God says, these people over here, in other words, he's kind of using the same language that they use against Moses, God uses against them, and he says they're stiff-necked people. And that doesn't change, right? He says they always go astray in their heart. It was a pattern of resisting God.
And Brother John, on that, talking about resisting it being willful, they knew what was happening because they didn't say,
Oh, yeah. Right.
They knew they couldn't walk away.
Right.
They knew God was
Right. I said that this morning, is that wasn't even an accurate statement because they knew exactly what was going on. And they already had the law. Moses had already met with God. He came back. He told them everything that God had said. He wrote it down for them. So it wasn't like they were just like, oh, we just forgot that part. That part just slipped my mind. He wrote it down, and he goes back up on the mountain to meet with God. And then they're like, we don't know what happened to him. But yet, they know. They can see the thunder, the smoke. And they know not to go up there. Right. So they know they can't go looking for him. But so then they come to Aaron and they say, make us gods that can go before us. And like I said this morning, the troubling part to me was that Aaron was just kind of like, okay, give me your gold. Let's do this. They built, and I said, and this is what I said. I said exactly the same thing about it. Well, first of all, the gold came from the gold that they plundered from the Egyptians, that God gave them in order to be able to build the tabernacle in order to worship God. But then it took Aaron carefully forming the calf. It was, like I said this morning, it wasn't just a Play-Doh project. He carefully formed the calf. So this wasn't just a, oops, we slipped up. This was a willful, intentional disobedience. But it didn't just happen in an instant, though. Yeah, because remember what I say, that the calf, I can't remember exactly what I said, but the calf didn't create the idolatry. The calf revealed the idolatry that was already in their heart. It was their opportunity to do what was already, to carry out what was already going on. So really it just exposed something that was within them. How many of y'all have heard of the name Charles Templeton? Anybody heard of that name? Okay, Brother Jim? Not many people know that name. How many of y'all know the name Billy Graham? Most of us in here, right? So in the 1940s, Charles Templeton was a Canadian evangelist, and he was actually best friends with Billy Graham. In fact, a lot of people would say that he had the potential to be an even greater influence than Billy Graham, as far as just his preaching and his influence and everything. And but over about the course of a decade, Templeton started dealing with some intellectual questions which allowed him, which he allowed to accumulate rather than being honest about and bringing into light, and it started eroding his faith. So this was in the 1940s. By 1957, he had left ministry altogether. And in the 1990s, he wrote a book called Farewell to God. Farewell to God. Now this was the contemporary of Billy Graham. I mean, they were friends. And in fact, like I said, some people even thought that he was more eloquent and talented than even Billy Graham. But he wrote a book called Farewell to God. So Lee Strobel interviewed Templeton near the end of his life. And it says, he said that Templeton was visibly moved when the conversation turned to Jesus. His voice broke. And he said, Jesus was the greatest human being who has ever lived, and I miss him. In fact, in response to Templeton's kind of falling away, Billy Graham had this kind of, it was, forget exactly what happened, I didn't write down these details, but like a stump moment where he basically just like, he came up to a stump and was just pleading out to God and like just put his foot or Bible on the stump or something. I can't remember exactly what happened. You might be able to remind me of the details, but just basically it was his like, I'm choosing to follow God moment. I'm choosing to stay with him. My friend may be falling away, but I'm choosing to serve. It was a Joshua moment, like, choose you today who you will serve. As for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord. That was basically what Billy Graham was doing at that stump moment. And so, what do we learn from that story? Doubting, having doubt or having fear or questions, and bringing those to the community of faith is not the same thing as hardening. All right, so what this story teaches us is a pattern of looking away, a pattern of trying to deal with things on our own in isolation without the accountability and the encouragement of the household of faith. Over the years can accumulate to a point where you come to a point where it's impossible to cross back over. He got to a point where it's it was easier for Templeton to just let his heart become completely hard than to come back to God. But at the end of his life, he even says, Jesus was the greatest human being who ever lived, and I miss him. All right, so but again, so Templeton, though, didn't choose to fall away in one day. It was an accumulation over time, right? It was, just 10,000 moments, so to speak, that each time seemed small. It seemed like an imperceptible amount of falling away. But eventually, he got to the point where he just let go. So drifting is way underestimated. The danger of drifting is way underestimated in the Christian life. Why? Yeah, because it doesn't feel like drifting, right? It doesn't feel like it's dangerous. It feels like it's a season or something that you'll correct next month. But, what does he say? Today, if you hear my voice. So, because tomorrow might be too late, like Brother Jim said. But so how do we avoid drift then? Well, okay, let's take the beach analogy. Because you're sitting in the beach, and sometimes you look up and you find yourself way far off from where you're supposed to be. What's one of the ways that you can avoid that drift at the beach? Exactly. Keep your eyes on the mark. To keep your gaze on what is important. Keep your gaze on that anchor point, right? Because what happens is when you take your eyes off of your stuff on the beach or the rest of your group sitting on the beach, when you take your eyes off of that, that's when the drift starts to become, easier. But if you're watching where you're supposed to be, then it doesn't necessarily guarantee you're not going to drift, but you're going to notice it. You're going to realize it when you start to get off the mark, and so then you can start correcting. And so you can start making those corrections sooner, and it's a lot easier than to make that correction than when you're, a quarter of a mile away and you're swimming against the current to get back. Because what we treasure, and I mentioned this morning, what we love and what we treasure is going to shape what we hold fast to. So if the author of Hebrews is saying, hold fast to the confession of faith, well, what are we holding fast to is going to determine, what happens to us. Because if we feel like we're losing our grip on faith, then if we're honest with ourselves, we would, and we look deeply enough, we would recognize that probably our attention, our gaze, is not on where it should be. Right? It's on other things. It's maybe on the pressures of life, on the things of the world, or the fears or the anxiety that we face. When we would recognize that our gaze is not upon Jesus, it's on the other things, our circumstances. We would notice that our time in the Word is fragmented at best, or probably non-existent. But like Brother Jim was saying, the Bible isn't just information. It transforms us. It shapes us, right? So if we, in the times that we drift, if we were to take a serious look at our time in the Word, we would notice that it's probably, like I said, just rushed or completely absent. And so then what is the correction? How do we get back? What do we do? Is it just like our willpower and we just muster up enough strength to get back? Yeah, we have to get back to studying the Word, get back to praying and keeping your gaze upon Him, knowing where you're going, and knowing, in order to know that you're getting back to the right place, you got to have your gaze in the right place, right? So if you keep your gaze on Him, right? That's a good point, right? You got to know what you're looking for. You got to know what you're looking at, right? All right, so let's see. Let's go to then how does hardening spread? All right, so let's take this into the community aspect of things, because again, the author of Hebrews isn't speaking to individuals; he's speaking to the community. He's speaking to the household of faith, and he's warning about something that happens to communities, not just individuals. All right? We've talked a lot about this in the individual sense, but this also happens in communities. And so, because look at the warnings in verse 12. Let's see. Let me go back to, Hebrews chapter 3. In verse 12, he calls them, he's addressing the brothers and sisters, all right? And what is he calling them to? This is still verse 12. Yeah, brothers and sisters, what? Yeah, watch out. Yeah, exactly. He's calling them to be vigilant, right? To watch out. And then verse 13, then he's assigning the work of encouragement to each other. All right, what does he say? Encourage each other daily while it's still called today. And then verse 14, he frames that holding fast, but it's in the first person plural. Look, for we have become participants in Christ if we hold firmly until the end the reality that we had at the start. And then verse 15 makes it's very clear that this is a community thing. Because in verse 15 he says, as it is said today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion. All right, so he talks about the one root of bitterness, but yet many people were affected by it. All right, so let's see. And what he's doing, he's not talking about a metaphor. He's not using this as a metaphor. It's really, because any pastor has watched this happen, right? That has seen this unfold. One person's bitterness doesn't stay one person's bitterness, does it? One person's bitterness, what happens? It starts to spread, right? That person tells this person, and that person tells this person, and then this, and then it's like things are starting to even get made up, and it's because it's like it's not just what happened with that one person. It's now this is it's become out of control, and I want to read a story about there was a synod of congregational churches in New England and they adopted what was known as a halfway covenant. And this was back in 1662, right? A long time ago, 1662. And the founding members of the churches had come to America, and they had they were on fire. They had a really just vibrant faith, and their children had grown up in the church, but many of them couldn't testify to the kind of personal conversion experience that their parents described. All right, so the synod faced a choice: require the same genuine conversion, require the same standard of genuine conversion for full church membership, or accommodate the second generation by lowering the bar. All right, so what do you think they did? They lowered the bar. All right, so the decision was made, and the decision was made out of pastoral concern for the children of these believers. And what I'm not saying is that they had to, but I'm just talking about they couldn't even give a confession of faith. Like that, I'm not saying that like they did believe but they just didn't believe strong enough or hard enough or whatever. They couldn't even articulate a confession of faith. And so what they did was they lowered the bar. And so the church actually started a two-tiered membership. One where full commitment was desirable but no longer necessary. But within 2 generations, the churches formed in genuine conviction had become indistinguishable from the surrounding culture. So in other words, what happened was they lowered the bar of church membership. They had these different levels, so to speak, of membership. And what happened? Within 2 generations, there was no distinguishable characteristic or distinguishing marks between the church and the world. In other words, the church had become like the world. And then, and Jonathan Edwards, many of y'all recognize his name. He was preaching in one of those churches a generation later, and he started trying to call the community back to something that it had decided was optional. And so he attempted to restore genuine accountability for church membership. And guess what the church did? It voted to dismiss him from the church. 230 members voted against him. Only 23 members voted to keep him as pastor. So, you got these churches who had experienced, the revival and vitality in life that now had let go, that they had drifted, and what happened? That drifting started to become hardening. Right? Did you see what I'm saying there? But here's none of the leaders of those churches were necessarily wicked people. Like, they weren't like just terrible people. What they were trying to do was trying to be kind and trying to find a way to accommodate more people. And so my point is that congregational hardening doesn't always happen with malice. It's not like an anger kind of thing or an evil kind of thing. Just, trying to make things a little bit more pleasant, trying to make things a little bit more manageable. Don't demand quite as much. Really kind of what I said this morning with the golden calf. I read a quote about how the golden calf didn't demand anything, didn't demand any obedience, didn't demand accountability. It was dumb, mute, and just basically worthless. Didn't do anything, but it was the God of their choosing. It was the God that they fashioned, right? So anyway, so let me so what's our response then? Our response to this hardening, this communal hardening, is not to withdraw in order to protect our faithfulness. That's kind of like what the monks did. They tried to withdraw from society in order to protect their faithfulness. But was that the answer? No. What ended up happening? They had no impact on the kingdom of God, like we talked about, I think, a week or two ago. Because really withdrawal oftentimes is what starts drift rather than fixes it. All right? Withdrawal never fixes drift. Because that we talked about this last week. The household of God isn't something that we just visit when everything's going well and things are going our way. And then we just kind of leave when things aren't going our way. Why? Because it's a community that we belong to. It's your family. You don't just choose to be there when things are good and then you leave when things are bad. It's something that, so being there also carries certain obligations and responsibilities. We all have a part to play. And so when one of the members of the household starts to drift, everyone should feel it. All right? So when one person holds fast, then that should encourage other people. In other words, it's a shared responsibility. Like Brother Jim was talking about in the last session, with the West Point example. They made a decision that nobody's going to get left behind. We either all make it or nobody makes it. Because when we take our hands out of the mess, what happens? If going back to the West Point example, if one of the guys had decided, well, I'm not going to do my part in order to help this person who can't make it get there because, hey, we got places to be, right? What would happen? It would make everybody's job that much harder, and in the end, everybody loses. So then the author of Hebrews says, exhort one another every day. When? How often? Every day. Exhort one another, as long as it is called today. Which is interesting, and I think this going back to what he said, like today, if you hear my voice. All right, so he's playing on that again, and he's saying, exhort each other every day, as long as it's called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. All right, so this carries a picture of a life that is lived in community, but one that many of us probably have never really seen. Let's be honest with you. Do we live that way every day? Why not? What? Yeah, like this, and being like picking each other up and carrying each other's burdens every day. Do we do that? Yeah. I think we have a lot of ground we have a long way to go. Now, I think this church is better than a lot at that, but we still have a long way to go. Yeah, right, exactly. Other churches aren't our standard. It's not like, hey, we're doing better than these other churches, or we're not doing as good as these other churches. But we should strive for this. The word for exhorting one another means to come alongside, to urge, to encourage, to appeal to, and it's the same root word as the word that we use for the Holy Spirit, paraclete. It's the same root. And what is one of the jobs of the Holy Spirit? What does he do? He what? Comforter. He encourages. Right? He also corrects and rebukes and teaches. Right? But so it's that same, it shares a root here with this word that he uses for exhort one another. And so this isn't just, hallway conversation kind of stuff. Like this isn't just, a casual conversation with somebody. What is it? What does it take? It takes intentionality, right? When you're speaking to each other with intentionality, you're moving beyond just the surface level, like, hey, how's your day going? Oh, great. How's yours? To what's real, how are you doing? How are you really doing? Right? Getting down to the deeper. And so, again, he's not talking to just the pastors of the church in this. He's talking to, and he's not even talking to just the veterans, so to speak. The seasoned, more mature believers of the group. Who's he talking to? All the group, all the brothers and sisters, right? So he gives the task to the entire community, all of them, to all of you exhort one another every day, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be deceived, none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And the word every day, it means what it means. It means what it says. Like this isn't, a lot of times we might use that kind of like as a, every day, day by day, like we just use it as a figure of speech kind of almost. But he really means what he says here. When he says every day, he didn't just think of, just weekly gatherings was enough, in other words. So what does that mean then? Yeah, we have to be at least intentional with it, to be involved and in touch and with each other's lives more than just once a week on Sunday mornings when we say, hey, how's it going? And you're like, yeah, it's great. Everything's good. Because, sin doesn't take the week off. It doesn't just happen on Sundays. It happens all week long. And so we have to be intentional with each other and we have to be vigilant with each other. So, so that could be, a simple text message or having somebody over for a meal or phone call during the week or, but being intentional with somebody, with each other about the things that are going on in our lives. Because he says, as long as it's called today. And there's an urgency to that, right? Not just exhorting each other every day, but as long as it's called today. So he's not saying that there's plenty of time. He's not communicating that there's, we got all the time in the world to do this. He's actually saying today, because there might not be tomorrow. Tomorrow might be too late. And he uses the wilderness generation as a warning. Because there came a day when God told that generation that they would not enter into his rest. There was a day when it was too late for them. Was that because God's not merciful? No. But why? Yeah, because there was a pattern of resistance, a pattern of rebellion that was sustained long enough to harden their hearts. Now, did they lose their salvation for those who were saved? No. They just weren't able to enter into the rest. So, just being present in each other's lives, I think, is a big deal, because and this is kind of what I was getting at. Because going back, I read last week. He says later in Hebrews, "Do not neglect meeting together, as is in the habit of some." He doesn't say, "Do not neglect meeting together when it is spiritually enriching." When everything is going well and everything is going my way. He says not to neglect it. Again, just period. And so that means that that means on the Sundays when we leave feeling no different than when we arrived, don't neglect meeting together. Or just when things get a little messy, don't neglect meeting together. So we have to be. And what does that mean when he says don't neglect meeting together? What is he saying? What? Be present, right? Be together. Like don't just not neglect. Be present. Be engaged with each other. Be present in each other's lives. Because we can be together and not be present with each other. There's a big difference between just people coming together and people who are actually involved in each other's lives. So we have to be involved in each other's lives. And but again, we have a great high priest who's not distant. So there's actually a phrase, and this is just what I read. Brother Jamie, you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I've never actually been in the military. But there's a phrase used in the military to describe the difference between a commander who leads from the rear and one who leads from the front. So the officer who's been in the same terrain as his soldiers, who has endured the same conditions and had faced the same fire, commands a quality of trust that cannot be manufactured from a distance, because he knows what he is asking them to do because he's done it himself. So the author of Hebrews is making the case that the person who rules over the household of faith that we've been talking about, the community of faith, is the Son who is over everything. Even before, he was the one who stood before the wilderness generation, before whom the wilderness generation stood in judgment. And so he's not a commander over everything who has observed our struggling from a distance. He actually entered into it. He was tempted in every way, just as we are. Yet he was without sin. And so he's interceding for us from a position of having experienced it. So in all of this, we can depend on Jesus because he is our great high priest. He's our anchor. He's that fixed point that we keep our gaze on and we keep our attention on. And because when we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before us endured the cross, just not despising the shame, and now seated at the right hand of God, He's the one that we keep our eyes on. And when we do that, not looking to the right or the left, drifting becomes a lot more noticeable and a lot more correctable. And when we all hold each other accountable, then, the drifting becomes a lot more difficult, I guess I should say. But, all right, well, that's all for tonight. That's all we had time for, at least.